You're making a mess.
Encouraged by the results from my cheapskate airbrush, I felt it was time to try something new and expand my boundaries into other areas of the hobby, and for me that was doing my first resin pour. It didn't really go to plan, but stay with me in the hope you don't make the same mistakes I did. But first, let me take you through the construction of the base. I'd been experimenting with circular bases with some really pleasing results, but for this one I wanted to experiment with using an irregular shape. Nothing spoils a landscape base than dead space, so it was my hope that by introducing and including some angles on my base, I could combat that challenge of dead space and add a sense of movement and dynamic to the scene. A scrap piece of foam was the inspiration for that angled approach. There was something about the proportions and the angles of it that I really liked, so the block was further modified to increase the fall of the land. I had this vision of the Panzer III coming down a steep embankment with a tree in the top left corner to add a sense of scale and that tall element that helps build a successful scene. Satisfied the elements would all be sitting where they needed to be, the groundwork is smoothed out using a layer of Sculptamold. This is a fibrous paper mache that when mixed with water makes for a quick and easy solution for this type of work. Once dry, I now look to tidy the edges of that foam up, and the quickest and easiest way I've found to do this is to use balsa wood for the face of the base, and I fit a 3M mounting film to the rear of it. It's then just a matter of trimming the timber to the appropriate size and adhering it to the foam and then trimming it close to the corners of the base. The top edge can then be trimmed to the lay of the land, however I'm leaving a little overhang so my next layer of groundwork will want to sit flush with that. I use the AK Terrains paste for my weathering and groundwork a lot of the time. It's such a handy product to have on hand because it's water-based and quite easy to work with. The paste is distributed across the base using a spatula and then softened with a fan brush moistened with water. And once I'm satisfied, I can sprinkle different soils and debris over the ground. Most of the soil is sourced from my garden, but I add to that concoction with some dried herbs from the kitchen pantry, as well as clipping small amounts from a seagrass ball. It's all about keeping it as random as possible, but making sure the majority of the groundwork is covered. Because the paste is still wet, it should hold most of that debris in place once dry. Tapping it with my finger helps settle it down so it doesn't look like it's floating over the surface. And whilst it's still wet, the model can be test fitted and sunk into the ground, ensuring a weighted look will be achieved over that surface. The soil and scatter leaves different tones and colours, so these are integrated into the groundwork by first blending them with flat earth and then building up the raised areas by adding buff to that flat earth paint mix. As the base evolved, so did the vision, and I got my itch to try my first resin pour. But first, I had to think about this tree. I tend to cheat a bit when it comes to making my trees, and like I did in the diorama I built around the Sherman from a couple of weeks back, I took a walk in nature and found an appropriate looking branch from a tree and started attaching the foliage by first drilling the locations and then fixing it in with a drop of super glue. That foliage I'm using is a commercially available product and it's branded by Model Scene, but I've got the feeling Ammo may be distributing it as well. It is a pre-flocked seafoam product which I can break down and use the pieces that fit in with the shape of the tree and the branch. It's surprisingly time consuming, but the result you can achieve using this simple technique is quite amazing. The tree could then be glued in place, but to further create a natural looking tree, I added some roots where that soil looks like it's washed away. The roots were actually they were actually roots. I'm always holding aside bits and pieces from the garden, and this example will work perfectly for what I'm trying to achieve. I could stall the pour no more, so I set my boundaries around the edge of the base where the water would fall. I used simple painter's tape to create my dam of sorts and set about sealing the groundwork and the edges where that tape met the timber in the hope that this would hold the resin back. I went beyond where I thought the water would stop, however I should have gone a little further as it would turn out. I added support to the tapes with the offcuts from the timber veneer I used on the base. The tape seemed too wavy, so the support should help pull that all in line. And now for the moment of truth. And really, in fairness, this pre-packaged resin product really takes the guesswork out of the equation. You get the resin and you get the hardener, as well as a couple of syringes. This is only going to be a small pour in the scheme of things, as it's a bit of a test for me, and the 2 parts of the resin were mixed with the 1 part of the hardener. A couple of drops of khaki drab are added to tint it, and it was time to put my money where my mouth was and commit to this pour. To limit and control the flow, the handle of an old paintbrush is used to funnel the resin over the model. By my observations, the bulk of the resin will sit in that front left corner and should level out around 2/3 of the way across the front. But it became obvious I'd miscalculated that, however, it was too late to really do anything about it. So the base was now in the hands of the modelling gods. I did have to address a few bubbles though by first trying to pop them, but then giving them a quick blast with a blowtorch. The base was set aside and covered for 24 hours to cure, and I knew soon after that first pour I'd had a slow leak as there was resin building up on the bench. It had also slowly altered the level of the water and made it dip somewhat through the centre of that area. Removing the tape the next day, that leaked resin could be seen on the balsa wood. It was disappointing, but probably not as bad as it could have been. So after a light sand, I painted the balsa with a couple of coats of black acrylic to hide my indiscretion. Not perfect, but I think I'll get away with it. Because the edges of the resin had lipped up the boundaries of that tape pretty badly, I'd had to shave the angle off and try and settle the look by stippling on that still water product using a soft brush. It's a shame I hadn't sealed further along the edge of that right hand side, because other than that, things were looking pretty good. Smaller pieces of foliage were added around the groundwork, and a lot of these pieces were sourced from a florist of all places. They often use mosses and lichens in their decorations, so they can be a really handy resource for the scale modeler. The tankers come from an Art of War set of figures I've had in the stash for longer than I can remember. 48 scale figures can be harder to come by than their 35th scale cousins, so I had to use what I had and modify these guys by first cutting their arms into pieces and gluing a central copper wire stem to hold the pieces in place. Milliput is a 2-part sculpting putty, and that was used to fill in the gaps and create the poses I was after. The figures are also enhanced by adding resin hands to them. The black uniforms were created by blending graduating layers of greys using a wet palette and acrylic paints. I'll take a look at figure painting in greater depth later this year, but for now the figures could be glued in place and the model could be glued to the base using a PVA glue. The PVA is a slow drying glue, so there is a degree of adjustment possible, but once in place the model is set aside to dry. To create the look of turned soil as well as integrate the model into the groundwork, I moved to VMS Smart Mud. I find that product is perfect for this style of thing because of the way it clumps and behaves. The mud is applied around the footings of the tracks and any gaps in the groundwork where the tank isn't seated properly. I can use a toothpick to further create realistic looking clumping mud and simulate that turned earth look. And with that, the project was complete. I like to think I learned something new from every build I undertake, so from that point of view it was a successful project. Getting the taste of the resin and honestly how simple it was to use really inspired me to undertake something more significant using these newly learned techniques. But before I can do that, I have a few other projects I need to tend to first, so I can promise you there will definitely be more resin another time. I was really pleased with that angular steeped base and the way it added the dynamic to the composition, and I'm always encouraged how quickly and easily the tree and foliage came together to add further sense of drama to that piece. Every time I work with this 48 scale, I seem to enjoy it just that little bit more. I've heard it termed the Goldilocks scale, and I think that term perfectly fits the way I feel. But tell me what you guys think. Do you like 148 as a scale? Have you poured resin? Was there a question you had about one of those techniques I showed? It's all good, I promise, and if you're thinking it, others are too, and I promise to personally answer every comment you leave down below. I have a few different styles of video planned over the coming months that will be more focused on the nuts and bolts of the hobby, but fear not, because I promise I'll be keeping these build tutorials up as well. If you're looking for a little extra and would like to support the channel, you could always connect with the community we are building over there on the Patreon page. Every member on that page is valued, even the free memberships mean the world to me. But in the meantime, remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
That wasn't so hard, was it?